move as fast as we might want it to. There's going to be times when life feels like it's all under construction, it's being reworked, or that we have to take a different path than the one that we thought. And then there's going to be times where life just feels like it's one big storm and we're not sure how long it's going to last, but we ride it out. Now, what's significant about this is that at each one of these points, we made the decision to push on because we had a clear understanding of where we were going. Now, if I take this away and I just put us all in a bus and we just start driving, right? Now, all of a sudden, some of these decisions start being made based on personal convenience. Hey, take that road. There's no cars on that road. Hey, let's go down that road. There's no construction on that road. Hey, there's weather over here. Let's go this way. And we start making all these different compromises based on personal convenience. And then we end up somewhere we had no intention of arriving, right? And there's an old proverb that says, where there is no vision, people perish. So part of my talk today is helping us get a clear vision of who we are becoming, and the kind of life that we want to live, okay? Because if we have that kind of vision for ourselves, then when things happen in our life, we should have a clear understanding of the decisions we need to make that are necessary to help us maintain our identity or to live out that life of wholeness and well-being. Okay, so I'm going to ask Bethany while I continue to talk. I've got a handout for you. This is something that I've taken from the University of California at Davis. They have a great website on wellness and well-being. And one of the things that they've done is that they have put together a wheel that are the dimensions of wellness. Some people, you might find dimensions that you want to add. You might find things on here that don't apply to you. Two things that I'll draw attention to. One of them is occupational. And one of the ways that we interpret occupation is really just about what is giving us meaning and purpose. So even if you're retired or you're not working, there are still things that we do that provide meaning and purpose, and that would fall into the occupational dimension. The other dimension I want to draw attention to is the spiritual dimension. The spiritual dimension is really just about our inner self and our inner being. For some people, that's religion and faith. For other people, it's philosophies, or it's just the things that help them identify who they are, and it's core to their essence and their being. And so that's part of the spiritual aspect. The website for more information is at the bottom. And as part of your homework for this talk, I won't be collecting it. This is really just for you to work out on your own or with your partner and community. There's a few questions that I have at the bottom of the sheet for you to consider. The first is, how would you like to be known in each of these dimensions? That comes back to having and creating a vision for your identity and who you're becoming. And then the second question would be, what would you like your life to look like in those areas? There may be things in those dimensions you want to add. There might be things you want to take away. You might be very happy with your life in those dimensions, and that's okay. But this is something for you to kind of think through and help you kind of create your own vision for yourself and for your life. Any comments or questions on that? Anything from our virtual community? Okay, great. So take that with you. That's something for you to keep and work through. And like I said, even though I'm assigning it as homework, I'm not collecting it. That's for your benefit. All right. So what happens when life gets messy or throws us a curveball? And while you're thinking about that, I'm going to write kind of our big topic here. All right, wholeness, this is what we're talking about. So what do we do when something happens that challenges the way we see ourselves or challenges our idea of the best life possible? What are some responses? Depression, okay? We'll talk a little bit about that. Anger, yep, we'll talk about some of that. That's good. Denial, yep, absolutely.
Anxiety.
Allowing everything to drop down with it, yep.
Anxiety.
So in this box of wholeness, as I'll refer to it, this is where we operate out of the best possible version of ourselves. This is where we identified how we want to be known to those around us, to the world, to our communities, right? And it's where we operate in a way that's integrous, as somebody said earlier, with authenticity to ourselves, right? There's no self-betrayal here, okay? But one of the interesting things about this is that life is messy, okay? And there are things that happen, like our traffic and our construction and our storms, that take us out of this box and make us question whether we really can be the best possible version of ourselves, or that we can live the best life possible. And this comes back to our story, okay? And I shared a little bit of my story at the beginning, and I'll share some as we go along. And so stories have language. And one of the languages that often comes into our heads when something doesn't go well is the language of guilt. Now, guilt is not about right and wrong, okay? Guilt, and I talk about it as a language, and the thing with languages is that they have patterns, they have cadences, they have tones and sounds. You know, if I started speaking German or French, you may recognize those languages as German or French, even though you may or may not understand it depending on your capability. But you know the sound, okay? You know the patterns of some of those languages. So guilt has a pattern too, okay? And guilt is a fact-based language. It speaks fact, it speaks truth, it just speaks to what is. And it's usually the law or our norms or our expectations that will determine whether those facts are good or bad, okay? So this is really about the facts of our life. Okay, now, in my story, when I talked about the way I was bullied and the rejection that I went through growing up, there were a couple things that I often told myself, okay? Some of them was, I failed. And I made a mistake. Now, I couldn't control the people that I encountered and the things that they said to me, okay? Because we can't always control what happens to us, right? But what can we control? Our response, right? We can control how we respond to things. And so we have two sides of this, and I apologize if some of this gets blocked out. We'll make it available at the end. There's two paths we can take. The first path is where we accept the story. This is about telling ourselves the truth of what's happening and what we're experiencing. So in some cases, it may be when I was in school that I failed a test, okay? Or I made a mistake on something. And so when I accept the fact that that's true, that that's part of my story, what would be a healthy response to that? What is it? Acceptance, work harder, right? So part of this is about learning from these experiences and finding ways to grow and to get better. Okay? So we'll have learn and grow. We'll get better. And this takes us back to our box. Okay? Because what happens when I do this, when I realize like, oh, I failed the test because I stayed out too late the night before and I didn't study. And so now the next time there's a test, I go to bed early, I don't go out with my friends. And when my friends say, hey, why don't you go out with us anymore? And I say, well, because the last time this happened and it didn't work out for me. Okay? So I learn from that, I grow, I get better. And now what's happened is I've taken that event and I've controlled the narrative of that story. Does that make sense? Okay? So now it becomes part of me, so I know now how to respond when that thing happens again, and I can respond from a place of wholeness. Because again, I'm controlling the narrative. Now, what happens if we don't accept the story or tell ourselves the truth? Somebody used the term denial earlier, right? When we're in denial, right? Well, there's another path that begins to happen. And this is where we kind of go in the opposite direction of wholeness. And the opposite of wholeness is what? What do you think the word is? Confusion, okay? Any other words? Dysfunction, yeah, for sure. Broken, that's a good word. Brokenness, right? So, disconnected. Anything from virtual group? Okay, so to kind of visualize this, let's imagine that this hand is me as a whole person, only because I don't have a lot of space on here and you don't want to see me try to draw a person. Okay, and as I go through life, things happen where I could become broken. Okay, and when I start going down this path of accepting the story and I start to process this, I can get back to a place of wholeness, as we just talked about, right? If we fail to accept the story of our brokenness, then what happens is we actually create another version of ourselves that we posture to everyone around us, and we keep that broken part of us a secret. So this side over here leads to secrecy. Now, when we start going down this path, a lot of things happen, often very, very quickly. And there's another language that gets introduced to our story. Who can guess what that language is? Lies, that's good. Shame, okay? What happens is we actually enter what I call a fog or a cloud of shame. Now, I mentioned before that guilt is a language of facts. Shame has a language too, and it makes identity statements. So shame is going to make identity statements. So when I start asking the question of why did I fail, shame is going to tell me it's because you're a failure. Or when I say, why did I make a mistake, shame is going to say, because you are a mistake. That's why you keep doing this. That's what mistakes do. They replicate themselves. That's what failures do. They fail. Shame is not interested in telling the truth. So everything on this side is a lie. It's not interested in helping us live out the best possible versions of ourselves. It's only interested in changing our identity into something else. So I'll use the Greek delta here for change. It's about changing our identities. And when we allow shame to control our narrative, again, it leads to a lot of things very, very quickly. The reason I put it in a cloud is because it prevents us from seeing ourselves as we really are and seeing life as it really is. So when I get out of a hot shower and my mirror's all fogged up, I'm probably not going to want to start shaving right away. Right? Things will get messy very fast until I can clear that away so that I can see clearly and pay attention to who I really am. Right? How many of you have driven through fog? A lot of us, right? And when you're driving through fog, you're pretty much both hands on the wheel and you're looking directly in front of you. You can't see life as it goes by behind you. You can't even see too far into the future, and you definitely can't see what's behind you anymore. And that's what shame does. It puts us in this fog, and it changes the way we see ourselves, and it prevents us from seeing life as it really is. Shame says you have to keep your brokenness a secret, because if people found this out about you, they would hate you, they would reject you, and you would be unlovable. So you better not let anybody find this out. And when we start to believe that lie is truth for who we are and for our story, we start living a life based on fear and anxiety. That comes next. Now, some of the things that I'm going to talk about are real emotions. They can happen for righteous reasons. So they're not all shame-based emotions, okay? But what as I'm going to lay this out, when we allow shame to tell our story, all of these emotions and all these things will be present, okay? What is a typical response to fear and anxiety? Anger. Anger and withdrawal, yep. So anger comes next. Now, what's interesting about anger is it manifests itself in two ways most often. The first is that it gets aggressive and confrontational with the goal of pushing people away, okay? So I'll draw some down arrows to indicate pushing away. The other way is we turn it inward to ourselves and we retreat from our loved ones, from our community, from others. And the goal is the same. The goal is to put distance between others and our secret, whether it's inward or outward. And then when we've pushed everybody away and we've retreated from everyone else, then where do we find ourselves? Alone, isolated. And I'll just do ISO for isolated for those of you that are taking notes. If we stay isolated for too long, then we enter another layer of all sorts of things, okay? And I'll use the acronym SAD, and that stands for suicide, addictions, depression, and other destructive behaviors. Yeah, great. She looking at my notes? And of course, this leads to a lot of other a lot of other problems, right? But the whole goal of this is just leading us further and further away from living a life of wholeness. Now, what's the reason I map this out, and I call it a map for a reason, because once we understand these pathways, it becomes a lot easier to recognize where we are and how we can get back on this road to wholeness. Now, as I mentioned, everything on this side is a lie. It's all a lie. So how do you undo a lie? You face it. And how do you face it? You tell the truth, right? So in some cases, when we're isolated, usually because of anger, right, we can ask people like, what's upsetting you? What's making you angry? What's causing you to push everybody away? And if they can acknowledge that they're angry, they can tell the truth at that one point, we can start working backwards, right? If anger is a fear response, then it comes back to, what are you afraid of? How are you afraid to be known? You want to move this out of the way? Okay, sure. I can move this over just a little bit too. Okay. So we start working ourselves backwards, right? But at any point, as soon as we tell the truth and we accept the story, that we accept the story and we start telling ourselves the truth, we now are able to operate on this side. Does that make sense? So as long as we're keeping things a secret, as long as we fail to tell the truth, fail to accept the facts of our life, we can operate over here. But as soon as we acknowledge that and tell the truth, we shift and we give ourselves an opportunity to get back into our box of wholeness. So I've talked about facts and I've talked about identities. Now I want to put them together. Every identity that we have is rooted in a fact. I'm a husband because I have a wife. I'm a father because I have children. I was a naval officer because I served in the Navy. I could say I was a failure because I failed my test. So you don't have to share this out loud, but think for a minute about some of the identities that you wear and what facts might be behind some of those. And they could be wonderful, positive identities. It could be identities that perhaps you're carrying around, like some of the ones that I've carried around that weren't healthy or helpful for me. And that's what this talk is really about recognizing that if there is an identity that we don't like, there's an identity that causes a lot of pain and suffering and perhaps doesn't put us in this box, then as soon as we start working on the fact behind that, we can process that, take control of the narrative, and work it back into our story. Does that make sense? So far, I've talked about having a vision for ourselves and for our life, the importance of telling ourselves the truth and accepting our story, and how to recognize the lies in our life and how to recover from some of those. So now, what about this so far has stood out to you? What new insights or awarenesses do you have that you'd like to share? There's a choice element. Yeah, that comes back to what we talked about, right? We always have control over how we respond, and that moment is critical. But sometimes we may not be aware that we have a choice, right? And we shift into default programming. What else? Mm. Yeah, it's beautiful. He just talked about that when we're in denial, I'll just kind of summarize. When we're in denial, that it's important that we are in a community of people and that we're surrounded with people who are telling us the truth. One of my mentors used to say, one of the great things about being human is that we can't see our own backside without help, right? We either need somebody else or we need a mirror, right? But we can't do it on our own. Yeah, thanks, Connie. What else? Anything else that stood out? Ring any bells?
Talking about the brokenness, and then Paul was really trying to portray
Mm-hmm.
a full image, whether it's, you know, a house of, what do you call it? What's the
House of Cards.
House of Cards. I thought that was poignant.
Kind of along the lines of shame, I think of guilt.
Mm-hmm.
And forgiveness of ourselves.
Yep.
And forgiving yourself can be the hardest thing, at least for me. It's one of the hardest things I can do is forgiving myself.
Yeah. And that's a whole nother talk that we could give, right? Just on forgiveness alone and the power that is. And sometimes even just, you know, confessing that things are what they are can have a lot of power to them. You know, and there's so many different programs out there that's the first thing that they want you to do is just to tell yourself the truth, right? And to acknowledge what's happened. And if you can do that, then forgiveness becomes a little bit easier. It may still take a while, may still be a process, but it becomes possible.
Linda wants us to continue to repeat the questions or comments just to make sure that.
Oh, sure. So one of the things that I've learned about life is that it's not all about me. There are parts of my story that I have had to reinterpret. And that dealing with rejection growing up and the bullying that I went through caused a lot of brokenness in my life. And I postured to a lot of people. How many of you have ever ordered something online and when it showed up in the mail, it was broken? Okay. And what do you do? You send it back, right? And I told myself that if people knew that I was broken, that they would reject me and they would try to send me back to where I came from. That was the lie that I told myself. So I played the shame game over and over and over again. And I began to believe that the identities that other people were projecting onto me out of their own shame was who I really was. So I would work hard to pick up all my broken pieces and try to put myself back together, hoping that I could present myself in some perfect way. Now, how many perfect people do you know? Anybody? Right, okay, we got one perfect person in the group, right? We're quick to identify that no one is perfect, but we are extremely slow at accepting the fact that no one is really expecting that from us. No one's expecting perfection because no one is perfect. And yet, somehow, we often think that that's how we have to portray ourselves to other people. What I didn't realize then was that those broken pieces of my story didn't belong to me anymore. Over time, I began to encounter other broken people. And I would look at them and I would see an empty hole in their life that looked a lot like one of the pieces that I was carrying around. And I could offer it to them. And in those moments where my broken pieces is filling a hole in someone else's life, not only can they find wholeness, but I get to find wholeness too. That broken piece now has purpose in not just my story, but someone else's as well. And that speaks directly back to Ken's point about how important it is to be in community. Wholeness abounds among us. It's possible among us. And I hope that you all hear that you are beautifully and wonderfully made. May you accept your story and find wholeness in your community with other people. Because when you do that, you're truly living out the best life possible. And that's all I got. Thanks for the opportunity to share. Yeah, if you're online, please don't hang up yet. And Meredith, I'll turn it back over to you. And sure. Questions or comments?
I feel like that last puzzle analogy was thinking about how the parts of your experience can really help somebody else. Just the visual.
Yeah, thanks.
It's a healing, somehow it's restored. Somehow I have something someone else needs. And you have something I need.
Yeah.
Has anyone had any experience with that in their community, whether it's be a faith community, it could be your neighborhood, it could be Parkinson's Point or another?
I think that where this touches the most meaning for me is looking at the groups that I belong to within the Parkinson community, exercise groups, study groups, whatever. And within those groups, I find the support that I find nowhere else. And that for me has been very instructive in my journey along the Parkinson path and very full of guidance, because invariably there's someone saying, either I've had this happen or I know someone who does, and this is what happened. So I learned from it. So my gift to my community is to be open and sharing.
For those of you online, Judith was just talking about the different groups that she's a part of within the Parkinson's community, and just the space that provides for not only for her to learn, but also to share, and just how powerful that exchange can be. It's a gift exchange. That's right. Yeah.
It's taken me, what you said with all of this is very resounding to me. Because I was diagnosed 5 years ago, and most people in my life do not know. So I've been hiding from it. And I'm finally getting to the point that I don't hide from it. So it's nice to find, a community. I think going forward in the future, this kind of stuff will help. So I just want to say I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Welcome.
Thank you.
For those of you online, we have someone new to the group, and was just sharing the importance of this talk to them, and just Yeah, I don't want to share too much of your story, so. But welcome.
I think with age, you realize you have your strengths and your weaknesses. And you can't focus on your weakness, you have to focus on your strengths,
Mhm.
strong areas, and what you can do to help people or to make things better for everybody.
Yeah, Meredith was just talking about as we get older, we become more aware of our strengths and our weaknesses. And I think even to your point, and what we're talking about here is being in community, is that we can lean more into our strengths on an individual level, right? And we can allow and give permission to our community to support us in our weaknesses. So where we don't have to own that, because something I'm weak in, you might be fantastically strong in. And now we get to spread that out and share it, and it makes everything easier in community. So that's a great point.
I'm noticing now that I'm telling more and more people that I have Parkinson's. I'm talking to someone who I don't know, because my dyskinesia started. And they're probably looking at the same phone. And I don't mind someone I have Parkinson's. Not do that. It's a lot easier once you get it out.
Yeah.
It helps me.
Yeah.
I'm a pretty outgoing.
Mm. Yeah. Gary, who's very outgoing, was just sharing about how often he's now telling people that he has Parkinson's, and how easier that's gotten for him, and has helped him get along with more people because of that open honesty.
All the time. When you share something like that, like having Parkinson's or maybe some other diagnosis, oftentimes people will then open their closets of what they're hiding and share something really impactful, whether it's they also have Parkinson's or a loved one has Parkinson's or some other really life-changing event, and it creates this really powerful connection sometimes that it creates an opportunity that otherwise we were both hiding in our closet before.
Mm. Yeah.
People often will say that they don't know what to say, or how to react when someone tells them that. When I was coming out, and telling people about it, I went to one guy who was anticipating his response, his MS, and I said to him, I got the Parkinson's, and all he did was he had a big smile on his face, and he said, "Give me a hug," and that just was the best thing anybody could have said at the time, and it really made it easy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think to your point, Joe, we worry so much about what other people think of us. Most of the time they're worrying about what other people are thinking of them. And then the opportunity to connect or share, most of us really just genuinely want to be there for the other person.
Yep.
Or show support in some way.
And this comes back to about learning how to control the story. And because to your point, Joe, yeah, people may not know how to respond in a way that is going to be helpful to you. Right? Most people want to be helpful. They want to show concern, but they may not have any.
We have a few questions from online. The first one is from Ed, and it says, how does one change depression into wholeness?
So where does depression fall on our map here?
Way down at the bottom.
Way down at the bottom, right? And so a big part of this, if it's related to isolation in some ways, or where it's like, oftentimes when people are depressed, they feel like people can't understand them, or that they're all alone, even if they're in a room, a crowded room. And so somebody with depression that's fully aware of that and wanting to get out of that, first of all, I'd say if somebody has depression, they need to do this with professional guidance and counseling and help. But it also begins with just being, again, coming back to community, partnering with someone, and again, telling ourselves the truth, accepting where we are. Like we come back to our road trip analogy, right? It's about, if all this is where we want to go, then the other side of the equation we need is where are we starting? We can't plot our journey if we don't know those two things. So if we can acknowledge where we're starting, then to what Joe and I were just talking about, of like communicating our needs and some of our expectations and seeking out the help that we need, we can start that process back to wholeness. Does that answer his question?
So we've also got another one.
Okay.
Online. So from Greg wants to know what role you see faith playing in dealing with this kind of situation.
Oh my gosh. I mean, so from a faith perspective, my faith tradition says that wholeness is where we are created in the image of God, that this is how God made us. And there's an old prophet that God speaks to and says, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And there's this idea that God knows what we look like in perfection, that God knows all our flaws, right? And so there's this idea that if God already knows what our perfect being looks like, both in body, in spirit, in mind, in all those ways, that as we go through this, right, there are things that God is using the people around us, he's using our experiences to help us grow and lean into that identity that he's created us to be. And shame for us is kind of the anti-spiritual, right? This is, or evil, right? This is about, again, this is about the lie, that we can't become that person, that person doesn't exist. And so it's about seeing through this, seeing through that cloud. In the New Testament, Paul talks about we only see now dimly in a mirror, but at some point we're going to see ourselves face to face in perfection. So there's this sense of like this, there's always going to be some type of fog or cloud, but it's about recognizing the lie. And so again, this comes back to accepting our story and recognizing the truth of who we are and who we're becoming. And if we can do that and we can recognize the lies, then I think our faith motivates us in that way to pursue this. Were there any other questions from online?
Yes, both Connie and Greg are acknowledging the strength of your answer.
Okay, great. And to Judith's point too, that faith just becomes another layer of community that you have, right? And we can get that from all sorts of places. We can call it all sorts of names. That's a great point. And I would just say too, you know, I'm really honored to be able to kick off this whole series. And the the handout that I've given you, and even some of the things that I've talked about here, I hope serves as a framework moving forward through this series. A lot of the other speakers are going to come in and they're going to touch on a lot of different aspects of this. They're going to touch on a lot of different aspects of the well-being wheel that I've passed out too. So keep some of this with you as you go throughout this series, and I think it's going to be a lot of fun. So thanks again for the opportunity to just kind of kick this off and share some of my story, and thank you for your attention. So.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That was wonderful.
Do you want to just kind of put the mic over by her?
Oh, sure.
So.
That might be hard.
Thank you.
It's
okay.
but I will turn it off.
So thank you, Stephen. That was wonderful. And this is the first session of our series, and we want to say thank you to Boston Scientific today. They sponsored our emotional wellness series. And we have more information out front at the sign-in table if you have any questions. They will be here too at some of our future events or future series. And thank you as well to all of our volunteers. Andre is an amazing gentleman who has donated his time, and I think he might have disappeared into another work call to help us with all of this AV setup today. Leon is one of our board members, and he has generously donated his time and help. And then if you haven't met Bethany and Sarah yet, who are two of our instructors, hopefully you will get to see them in a class soon, because watch out, you will be hurting after. And Robin, but it's always fun in a good way, And Robin is also one of our instructors too. And you met Molly, one of our board members, at the check-in table with the cute little baby girl. And Joe is one of our board members as well. So we just are really grateful to have their help today. So thank you guys. If you have questions, if you need anything, just let us know. And this is time to also just catch up with your table.